Well, thank you, everybody. The point of this discussion is kind of to take that energy and big picture and aspiration that we've had from Dan and bring it to our place, and to try and unpick and look at what that practice actually looks like and feels like, and what are the things that we can do from now to continue to extend that practice. So the way we'll run this is we will have a panel discussion from lived experience around how do you fund for impact, what does it look like, what are some of the tools and resources, what are some of the traps and tips that we need to be aware of, and then we'll open it up for a discussion with everybody where you have a chance to contribute, ask questions, and tell us that you disagree or whatever that may be. I have to start with the panel by asking them for their top line responses from Dan's whirlwind overview of the power that is the social change sector. We are a powerhouse sector. We employ 10% of all working Australians as a sector. We are 8% of our GDP. We are an amazing sector for economic and social growth in Australia. And what I particularly loved about his speech was the message to reframe for ourselves our work and our purpose into that absolutely explicit economic, social and cultural asset builder for the nation. So I might start with you, Squirrel. Just top line thoughts, intellectual or emotional, what stood out to you?
I'm incredibly pleased that half of the audience is now supposedly showing a profound ability to be pissed off at me.
Reece?
Not apologising for taking risks. So, in our world, we are problem-solving organisations. We are facing some big problems, and climate change, biodiversity loss, ageing population. They require big, bold solutions, and we shouldn't apologise for taking risks in order to build those solutions.
Thanks, Sarah. And just first of all, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional landowners, the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. And I was blown away by Dan's presentation, and I'm not sure we even need this panel discussion. Everyone should just listen to what he has to say. But what resonated with me is my dream, and the dream for the organisation that I represent is that every Indigenous child would have access to reach their full potential and the same access to opportunities that we would expect from our children, that everyone would want for their children. But my dream wouldn't be realised without people working in that space. So as a funder, I have very limited capacity to deliver on that dream, and I need to do everything I can to support the organisations doing the heavy lifting.
Thanks, Gemma. As a Bundjalung woman myself, but born on Gadigal country, I would also like to pay my respects to the Gadigal elders. I think the biggest thing I took away from that conversation is that we need to invest in the sector. We are doing amazing things. We really want to change the world in a lot of ways, and we need to take risks and be allowed to take risks. But most importantly, I think for Indigenous communities, we need to be trusted to come up with our own solutions. For a long time, people with the best intentions have funded us to deliver programs that they've designed themselves. And even though we've been funded to deliver them, they haven't always been what the community needed. And on the flip side of that, when we've come up with our own solutions and we've costed those out, we haven't been trusted that the amounts that we've actually said it's going to cost were correct, and often only given half the funding, so cut off at the knees. So I think that trust is really important, and that's certainly something that we get from the Cages Foundation.
So what stood out to me then from those 4 initial responses, 2 words, courage and trust. Because actually, Squirrel, what you talked about requires a lot of courage. And you too, Reece, talked about the courage to innovate, the courage to fail. Gemma, you talked about the trust in terms of partnering someone to actually give life to your goals and dreams and purpose. And Jocelyn, you talked about trust to be given, self-determination to have the resources to do it with and for and by yourselves. So we'll pick up on those 2 things, I think, of trust and courage as we work through this. So to start with the 2 J's, the funder-fundee relationship partnership. Jocelyn, when you entered into the partnership with Rachel and with Gemma and Cages, what did you want them to know and understand about you and how you wanted to work in order to set that partnership up from the get-go in the way that would predicate its success?
To be honest, I went into the relationship not knowing much about the Cages Foundation at all and not knowing Gemma or Rachel at all. And so my intention was to be as honest as I could possibly be about this was a big dream and there was a lot of risk taking involved and a lot of trying and testing. So I was really hoping that as a funder they would allow us to learn and understand that we would make mistakes, but that was okay.
And how much of that, though, was explicit from you to them in those early conversations?
I don't think a lot of it was explicit, but we were quite frank. I know that Adrian, our chair, was quite frank initially with the foundation, and we're very lucky to have a really engaged board who speak openly about it, so that was great.
And so, Gemma, for you guys then, if that wasn't necessarily explicit but perhaps implied and emerging, what was or wasn't clear to you? How did you then frame the start of that funding relationship? And what, if anything, as those expectations became explicit, did you have to adjust in terms of your approach and your expectations?
It was probably more explicit than Jocelyn realises. So the plan that was presented to us on paper was a very polished SVA-driven consulting business case, and we looked at it and went, wow, that would be awesome if that was achievable, but had reservations that the 12-month, 2-year, 5-year plan was going to be achievable and the figures on the paper were real. But it became apparent very early on in conversations with at the stage, because we funded, I think, before Jocelyn was employed as the CEO. So we were having conversations at a board level with Adrian Appo, Lee Armstrong, and they were very honest in that we actually don't know what we need to achieve. What we know is that there is a gap. We know that we have the right people to fill this gap, and we can have the conversations with, in this case, Indigenous enterprises, build those relationships, and we have that trust. So we knew that we were funding the initiation of a strategic planning process. And that honesty you don't get often as a funder, and to have that frankness up front gave us a lot of comfort that, okay, we don't need to set outputs, we don't need to set outcomes at this stage, and that certainly evolved as First Australians Capital have become a more mature organisation. Our processes have changed as they have developed, but initially it was apparent to us that we needed to trust the governance of the organisation, so we did a lot of due diligence around the governance and the board and the people that were driving it, and then we were happy just to have open conversations. And I think as a funder, you can't do your job effectively if the organisations you are funding don't trust you enough to tell you what's really going on. So to have that openness from the start was really important to us.
How clear were you guys, both with yourselves and then with your partner, around your intent for the longevity of the relationship, the amount of money that might be available as it progressed? Like, how clear was that roadmap?
We take an approach when we build a relationship building and a due diligence process into our funding process. We are explicit that we prefer to enter into long-term partnerships and make smaller but more significant grants for the most part. But we recognise that relationship building takes time, and that is a cost to a non-profit organisation. So we essentially fund that getting to know you period. I think from memory in the cases with FAC, it was a $50,000 grant was our initial grant, and that grant was a please trust us, like this is an untied grant, but spend time getting to know us. If our interests and our theory, our thinking isn't aligned, the relationship isn't built, then we may walk away. But if at the end of this process we get to know each other and there is an alignment and we trust each other, then I think the expectation for it, we're very explicit about our funding principles and we like those longer term relationships. So I think you can expect that. Is that fair? I don't know.
So Jocelyn, would you describe it the same way?
Yes, I would. both Rachel and Gemma were very clear at the start that they do invest in long term, and which I thought was interesting for our organisation, because generally we're outside of the cages investing in children mission, but the organisation could see that investing in economic independence for Aboriginal people would result in outcomes for Indigenous children.
So that you've just described, philanthropy as the social risk capital. All right, so we don't quite know where we're going to end up. We don't quite know what it's going to do, but actually, it's the freest amount of money that's in our resource pool that we can use to try that. So, Reece, coming to you, what's your experience been of using philanthropy as your social risk capital, good, bad, or otherwise?
So we're at an interesting stage now where we've reached maturity on a couple of big innovation projects we've been working on for the last couple of years, and we're actually working with funders and philanthropists at the moment to get these projects funded to take them to scale. And we're talking about for example, a tool that we think will fundamentally transform the way that supply chains operate around the world to massively reduce worker exploitation, massively reduce environmental impact by increasing transparency in supply chains. And we're using blockchain for that. So we're pretty excited about working with philanthropists to take us to scale on that now. However, and this goes back to the question about not starting with the end in mind. So 2 years ago, we said, we think there is a lot of value in exploring emerging technologies. So we don't want to leave it all to Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. We think that NGOs need to be in this conversation. We need to be in this conversation, and we need to be steering these emerging technologies in the right direction for clear social and environmental impact. Now, we didn't know at the beginning, nor did we have the desire to know that we were going to be building a blockchain-enabled supply chain traceability and transparency tool. We spent a lot of time just exploring and sitting with the tension of not knowing at the beginning. So really having a look at what the emerging technologies were. We had a look at 8 different emerging technologies, and we spent a lot of time speaking with experts and using rigor in the way that we analyze those technologies to say, okay, for us at WWF, in relation to our priorities, and our priorities is transforming the way that markets operate to remove environmental impact, we think that blockchain has a really interesting opportunity for us. So it wasn't until about 6 or 7 months in that we actually took the dive into going, we're gonna go all in on blockchain, and we had to be able to sit with the tension of not having that clear end in mind to begin with, but have confidence in our approach and in our methodology that in our embracing an experimentation culture, we could actually arrive at a solution that was going to be able to be scalable. So where we went from there was to put in place a clear methodology for testing and experimenting, and making sure that every dollar of donor money that we used was used in the best way. And now the way that we approached that was to say, what are the smallest possible contained experiments that we can run to prove a set of hypotheses that we think that this technology is going to be fundamentally transformative in our space. And that's what we do through Panda Labs. Panda Labs is a framework that enables us to run these experiments in a safe and contained way with a lot of confidence that we can give to donors that their money is being used effectively. And it wasn't until we'd run a series of contained experiments through a 12-week validation sprint that we were confident in saying, yes, this ticks all the boxes for us. We're now going to take this to scale. And at this point now is the really interesting bit where we can work with funders to take a solution to scale that we think is going to fundamentally transform a lot of, or solve a lot of the problems that we're working on.
Okay, so you broke down, am I right in saying then that you broke down your innovation process into bite-sized chunks that Philanthropy could partner with you on, but you used an expression. You said to make sure that we use the philanthropy dollar as effectively as possible, and that's a term that we use a lot, but let's unpack what effectively means then in that instance, because it does not mean guaranteed outcome, does it?
It means having trust in our process.
Okay, so how did you build the relationship then with your funders for them to give you the trust to take that walk with you?
Well, I should probably qualify this, that I'm not in the philanthropy team at WWF, so I don't often go out and have a one-to-one relationship with funders. We have extremely able and well-qualified people to do that, some of whom are sitting here today as well. So I'm probably not the right person to answer that specific question, but I think that what we do in working as a team with the philanthropy team is articulate the story that we're trying to tell effectively, articulate the problem that we're trying to solve. And this is another key point, I think, in feeling okay to spend a lot of time. In fact, the majority of the time, making sure that we're solving the right problem before we're moving into building the solution. And that's what we were able to work on with our philanthropy team, to make sure that we articulated the problem. And now that we have what we think is a really credible solution, working with our philanthropy team to make sure that we're telling the right story about the methodology that we use to arrive at that solution.
Okay, thank you. So, Squirrel, as the pioneer, which you are, in Australia, thank you for doing all this work, it's fantastic, in helping philanthropy itself think about its impact and effectiveness as an agent in that change process, and supporting your partners then to build their capacity in really understanding the relationship with their program logic model, with their outputs and their processes, with impact. This all sounds pretty complex and intimidating, right? So that was fantastic, Reece, but you talked about labs and bite-sized and really good theory, and it sounds kind of quite big and very clever, and not sure I completely understood it. And again, Gemma and Jocelyn, there's a deep history of conversation and trust there. That all can sound a bit intimidating. So if we don't have the brain like Reece and the approach like Jocelyn and Gemma, how the hell do people like me start?
Excellent. I will answer, assuming then I have neither brain nor capacity for relationship. I did sit around thinking Panda Lab. I had such an image of what that might actually entail.
Doesn't involve live pandas, just to qualify that. I'll be out of a job as a
Yeah, teasing you. Happy to answer, but also it was May Wong's quote that you've never been so smart, so intelligent, so beautiful as when you get a job in philanthropy. So I'm just an ordinary human answering the question for now. Okay. But I'm going to speak to some of the funders in the room, and forgive me, I have a 14-week-old, and this is my first time out of the cage. So I have mostly written, so I don't waffle on about how cute she is. Okay. So, first of all, for funders, there's a woman named Julia Kaufman who I pretty much worship from the Harvard Family Research Project, and I wolf up anything she puts out. If you want, she's the convener of the International Geek Club, or Evaluation Roundtable for foundations. So if you're a true geek, hop onto the Center for Evaluation Innovations website and just follow what they put out. Anyway, her most recent wisdoms were all around learning, and I think that answers your question neatly. Don't be afraid to try, don't be afraid to learn. Fail, pick yourself up, try again. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be great at relating to people. Honestly, all you have to do to be a philanthropist is have money, but don't be afraid to learn. So I'm going to use her framework to scaffold a quick answer to that question. So first off, she said, make things visible. Make your thinking visible, more importantly. So now it's trendy in the philanthropic sector to acknowledge that operating in a black box or an ivory tower actually reduces effectiveness, both of your dollar and the nonprofits to whom you're giving. So we entered our data into glass pockets. So I'm going to share a couple of our learnings. I can't call them mistakes, or my comms team will edit that video, so we'll call them learnings. There's a website called Glass Pockets. It's a US-based transparency, more or less league table. Whoa, we had nowhere near the number of green ticks. You can look it up on your phone right now. We thought we were going to be top of the chart. And so we've created things like a knowledge center on our website. We had to build our own capacity. So I guess the first question I would put to funders is, do you have a website? Or if you're smaller, can you explain why you fund or make the funding choices that you make? Do you fund capacity? Why or why not? Really informative what Dan was saying earlier. Can you justify the choices that you're making? If you have no idea, start somewhere. Doesn't matter. Back of envelope. Just being able to articulate, starting that thinking. And as Dan put it, what is my ridiculous dream for making impact on the world? Sketch it out. Number 2 on Julia's list, ask powerful and meaningful questions. So the situation here is we've got multiple high-quality applicants, putting in applications or tapping us on the shoulder. How do you select what maximizes impact? And when you get in that murky world of capacity, it gets even tougher, right? Well, capacity building is trendy, so you might as well just roll up your sleeves and get into it. And grant making is high risk. So we gave a $500,000 grant to an unnamed organization, please don't try to look it up, who lied to us that they were about their financials, and we found out they were not even paying their employees superannuation. Not good. Not good on us. Now, our mistake, we had one staff member leave. We didn't cover our bases well. We didn't do the due diligence on that one. We just split up all her projects and didn't really look. Yeah, so our mistake, most definitely. However, what we learned from that is probably more important. So we made a mistake, but you roll, just like a kayaker. You go upside down, you get back up again. Rubric there. We now have a list of things that are important to us. What is the governance like? What's the organization budget like? Scale from 1 to 4, very transparent. When we go on a site visit, anything under a 3, we just question. Nicely, politely, not like an interrogation, but we aren't afraid to ask, and we ask the same questions of all cross organizations, and that was just so we didn't fall down, like what you were saying about due diligence and governance as well. And so my question is, what guides the questions that you ask when you take site visits? Don't take site visits? Start. Make one. Meet the people. Next up, number 3, Julia says, have gathering routines. Ooh, fun in the morning. To make good decisions, gather data, but you want to gather data without making the folks whom you're giving money to pull their hair out and hate you. So one thing I noticed when I first got there is we had an excessively long final report and shelves of folders, paper folders containing them. We got onto Blackbaud's gifts. You pick your poison for what you like. It can be Microsoft Excel. It can be your own folder system. Took the 17 questions and knocked them down to 7. The only question that I added was, and I'm kind of glad watching Dan's presentation, what leverage? How much leverage did you get from government and non-government sources? Because leverage is the currency of philanthropy. Our governors love it when they say, we gave 50, ooh, and they were able to raise 250. So whether it's to fundraising or to a project and other people come in on the project, that is absolutely a currency language. If you can't show outcomes with your capacity building for nonprofits, try showing leverage gained. Try showing how much fundraising you achieved. And so to all the folks giving out the money, how do you gather and store your data? Don't have any data? Don't gather it? Start. Get an Excel spreadsheet. Open it. Just try. See. Number 4, pay attention to causal inferences. Funding the familiar. Colin Pidd says that Australians really base success on relationships. Often we fund based on relationships. Americans based on solving a crisis. Explains America, right? Laugh at my accent. I'm from New Zealand. It's a mistake. It's a mistake to only fund the familiar, and it is possible to access capacity. So we funded 13 organizations. We gave them a little bit of money to do a mentorship program on fundraising capacity building. I'm so sorry if you're in the room. What we found from that is that the person, and I'm really sorry if that person's in the room, who was doing the mentoring wasn't doing a great job. We got feedback from 12 out of the 13 saying, thank you, Ian Potter. Gosh, you're great. ... And very little sort of openness, but you could definitely tell. So ended up bringing them. Did it work? No. Show me the money. How much did your leverage increase? In some cases, it decreased. In some cases, grants they had previously gotten year upon year, they actually didn't get, following the advice of the mentor. Ooh, our mistake. We tried, but we made a mistake, and we found that that is not the way forward. That is not to say do not fund mentorship programs and fundraising. That is to say pick your mentor wisely. Similarly, though, to flip that, we have funded database upgrades, IT systems for CRMs, for fundraising people. All right, and in one rush, I saw we had 3. And you could tell from the final reports, 2, they purchased a CRM, they got names on it, they were using it. And one just was like, oh, we wanted to investigate more cloud-based stuff, and isn't it? That nonprofit has since folded. Yeah, and it just, not to say that cloud-based is bad, but don't be fooled. If somebody comes to you and says, we want to fund capacity building, yeah, you can do it well and you can do it poorly. And you can be a strong organization, you can fund a strong organization who is really making a difference or taking a high risk and possibly will fail but doing it great. Or you can fund idiots who are wasting your money. Not good. And I hate to say that when half the room might hate me, but as funding capacity and fundraising becomes trendy, don't be doped into thinking that all is equal. We have made that mistake. Okay, so what do? If you recognize a program does not have high performance, support it to improve, but then have the guts to walk away. You have to start somewhere. You have to have the conversation. How can I help you to be more effective? Start with that. Make it around effectiveness, not around how overhead. But then if someone isn't doing their job, man, kids' lives are depending on these programs. Don't fund one that doesn't work. Nothing makes me more upset than when a program that doesn't work keeps going, because that's teachers who could be teaching a program that worked. That's children who could be back with their families. Don't mess around with them. Sorry, off high horse. Back. Number 5, Julia. Integrate reflection into day-and-day work. It's easy to run fast if you don't know where you're going. Our CEO came back from a summer US tour. He also saw the Ford Build program, quite impressed, and said capacity building is cool, to use my favorite word, right? Capacity building is cool. So now we reflect a bit on Trump's, we call them one-page Trump summaries. We look at how our program areas are going. We have fields, what did we learn from this grant? But let's be honest, we don't do it daily, and the day-to-day grind of our administration often takes the place of that. So as a funder, figure out how to work that reflection into your routine, because otherwise we'll be running fast into capacity building efforts and not have any idea where we're going.
Thank you. Can you pass it that way? Because I now want to go straight back to Reece and Jocelyn. So I agree with you, Squirrel, that there is a growing understanding and appetite for funding capacity building and for funding leadership development, for funding the underlying resources to build and scale. But I'm an optimist, so I always look for the green shoots. What does it feel like from your perspective? Are you seeing this? Do you really think that we're starting to change a view in Australia around funding capacity? Reece, Jocelyn?
I mean, I can speak from experience in building and trying to fund Panda Labs. And perhaps this is, we need to own this on our end, is that, and this is going back to the confidence question. We are very good at communicating the output and what we're trying to do, but I think there is still room for us to improve in how we work with funders to say, fund our way of getting there. And for us, that was about building Panda Labs. Now, we funded that primarily through, or we resourced that primarily through internal resources, right? So my time, my salary, we didn't really have a very big budget. We had practically no budget, actually. So I think there is still room for us to do more, to engage funders and say, come with us on this journey to help us build the structures that we need and scale these structures in order to have these big impacts. Now, if the assumption is that, we, in addition to our business as usual work, we've developed 2 potentially transformative new products, new tools that we think will have a dramatic impact on sustainability globally. Why shouldn't we be building 200 of them? And in order for us to build 200 of them, we need the right kind of capacity and the framework to do that. So I think that's the next opportunity for us and the next challenge for us as well, is to get there.
I'm going to speak really frankly here, and I think that the rest of the organisations in the room will agree. There's an inkling of people wanting to fund capacity building work, but certainly not at the scale that's needed to create impact. We're all sitting here in this room on not-for-profit salaries. And as Dan pointed out, when the CEO of a bank gets $27 million a year to make profit for a small number of shareholders, and people like us are working on very low wages trying to change the world, I think there's a lot more that could be done around capacity building. Having said that, the 5 funders that we have on board are specifically on board because they were willing to fund capacity building and recognise that if they didn't invest in us, we couldn't then invest in our community's own economic independence. So it is a relationship of trust, but we could certainly do more.
Gemma, did anything that Squirrel said resonate or clash with you in terms of your experience and your perspective, because you work with different funders and different sized funders to Ian Potter?
Yeah, I think most funders are different size to Ian Potter Foundation. Look, Squirrel gave a wealth of information, and I'm glad it's being recorded so I can go back and listen to it all and take a lot away from it. I think we are not resourced nearly as much as Ian Potter Foundation. and we do the best that we can. I think what you need, as a funder, what you need to understand is two things. I think there's a difference between impact, reporting on impact, and acquittal reporting. And you need to be really clear with who you're funding, on what you require. And if you don't have the skills in-house to necessarily understand impact reporting, then you either need to skill up and employ those resources, or not expect organisations to report on impact. And if you do expect organisations to report on impact, I'd really ask that you consider why, and is it for the benefit of the organisation so they can inform the work that they're doing and pivot if required, or is it so you can say, hey, we report on impact? And the second thing is if you require organisations to report on impact, understand that that's complex and be prepared to fund it.
So let's explore that a little bit. We did a study tour to the UK last year. Is Georgina still here? Hello, Georgina came with us. And one of the things that we picked up was a bit of a backlash from a number of trusts and foundations around the reporting and measuring impact. And it's, the old quote, the things that matter you can't measure. What gets measured gets done. The things that don't matter that can be measured, suddenly that's what gets done. So before we launch ourselves, holus bolus, down this funding and measuring impact path, what are perhaps some of the complexities and subtleties within it that we need to be aware of? Because sometimes surely just funding a good thing because it's a good thing is a good reason to fund it, isn't it?
Yeah, and also I think, Sarah, when you're funding, if you're prepared to take risks, or you want to fund innovation and you want to fund new things, you don't know what impact you're going to see. So setting up evaluation frameworks to report on impact that you don't know what it's going to be is really challenging and really complex. I think there's definitely a place for measuring impact, and I think you should be asking the right questions. You should be asking around an organisation's efficiency, effectiveness, how they're solving problems, and not what are their overheads. I think I don't need to go to qualify anything that Dan said. I think he's really illustrated that point well. But if you're asking to really measure impact, I think that's when a theory of change or a program or a project is at a point where you're really looking to scale, and you need to build an evidence for some serious funding to come in to support that growth. I'm not sure impact measurement has a huge place at the formation of new ideas and philanthropic risk capital, innovation, whatever you want to call it. I think we need to be really cautious around measuring impact. I think we need to be asking for impact and trying to achieve impact, but not necessarily putting the onerous task of measuring impact on small, innovative nonprofits.
Squirrel, lined up for you there.
No, I agree. There's definitely a place for what you might call a formative evaluation, or going easy on people because they're doing great work and it's only one person working 24/7 when they've been funded to work 23/7. Yes, I agree with that. However, there's a point, and I would say, to be clearly numeric, why not? 3 or 4 years into a program, you might start to be able to get a few outcomes. And 5 or 6 or 7, certainly a bit longer term, I don't always use the I word myself of impact. In fact, you won't see it on any of our acquittal forms, but yes. No, and you need a lot more data and a lot longer term. Completely agree with that. Absolutely, you need to be funding what you're asking people to do. So if you want measurement of any type, whether that's formative, outcomes, business case, then you need to be funding that. And if you don't have enough, join in with partners, because that capacity isn't going to appear overnight.
Right, so I'm going to take the prerogative now and pick up on the social risk capital bit, because that's the bit that I think is really powerful about philanthropy. And out of then that conversation, this sense of if we are using philanthropy in its most powerful way as that risk capital, presumably then we have to have a lot of courage and a lot of tolerance for failure. So Jocelyn and Reece, can you give us your perspective on how comfortable both within your organisations and the initiatives that you've got and also your partners, how you feel our risk tolerance is stacking up and our comfort with failure?
I have pretty limited experience with philanthropy generally. I'm actually quite new to working with philanthropy on social risk capital. For Aboriginal people, we've largely been engaged in government, which is completely risk averse. So from my perspective, the philanthropists that we've got relationships with have been very, very good at using their social risk capital well and wanting to do things that government isn't willing to do just yet until we've tested and give an example of how it's worked. So my experience has been very positive. I'd say, 8 out of the 10 funders that we've approached have been very positive about, let's just give you some money and try it and come back to us and tell us your outcomes, not your impact. Even though we had run some pilot programs that we measured in partnership with Social Ventures Australia, so we were able to demonstrate impact as well. But yeah, my experience has been very positive. I'd love to see government doing more in the risk capital space as well.
And internally though, within your own organisation as well, your own comfort with risk and failure?
Yeah, look, absolutely. Have an awesome board who are very comfortable with risk and failure. We've been social innovators for a long time. And so I'm really fortunate to have the likes of Leah Armstrong on our board who, worked as the CEO of Reconciliation Australia, so really engaged corporates in reconciliation action planning and getting them to take risks, working with Aboriginal communities. We've also got Australia's first venture capitalist on our board, so he's like, just get out there and try it. I can tell you now, governments have spent millions and millions and millions, billions of dollars on consultants working with Aboriginal communities, and I'm telling you, $100,000 on a business plan is much better spent employing that person to give it a go.
Thank you. Reece?
Yeah, I think there is a really a positive shift in NGOs to celebrating failure, and I know I've been sort of chucking out a lot of buzzwords today, and one of those is about productive failure, right? And actually celebrating failure, and some of this is to do with the creeping adoption of the startup culture in Australia or globally, and I don't think that's a bad thing. So, Dan spoke about this dichotomy between NGOs and corporates and the expectations put on both of them, and I think that one of the so it's hard enough for startups to innovate, right? And startups are small, they're fast moving, they're digital natives, they take risks, they fail quickly. So imagine at the NGO level where you have these embedded business models and your primary motivation is to increase efficiencies. Like it's a DNA shift for us. And I think we're heading in the right direction. But when it comes to failure, I think the number one lesson for us is, let's not fail on the $500,000 thing. This is what Squirrel was talking about before as well. Let's fail on the $5,000 thing, and let's actually celebrate that failure, because we know that we shouldn't do that again, and we've just saved ourselves $495,000. So, and that's the methodology that we use. The greatest thing about being in our sector is that we can share those failures with each other as well. So, in theory, you only need one NGO to run that experiment and disprove that hypothesis that is not the right way to build that solution, and you can share it, and you can share that IP with each other as well. So, that's a really healthy direction for us to be moving in as a sector.
Thank you. So we're going to open it up. Your turn. Questions, comments, challenges. I'm just looking at a few people in the room that we had a discussion last night around governance, and one of the issues that came up around governance in the non-profit sector was around actually the risk aversion of a lot of non-profit boards. And we've just heard a couple of examples where that's not the case, but that's an issue. So please go for your lives, just introduce yourselves. We have a couple of roving mics. I am going to be a bit of a parrot because they're recording this session, and so I will need to repeat the core of your question so that it gets recorded. So I'm not, sort of following you around like a puppy, copying you. I'm doing it because I've been asked to. So, questions, comments, observations. Thank you. So Jane, just let us know who you are. Yep.
Okay, I'm Jane Tucker. I'm from my own organisation, JMT, and I'm here today from a group called the Growth Project, which is a combination of business and charity leaders, and often funded by philanthropists. Now, my question actually is probably more for Reece and for Squirrel. just knowing the work that you're doing, and you didn't mention it in your outlines, so I would just encourage you to elaborate on it. Reece may have started it, but if we're talking about part of this future, there's a real global language, which is obviously the link between the local and the more global alignment. And if we're also trying to assist with funders being part of that impact language, I think there's something in this social or the sustainability development goals, or the SDGs, the global goals, and how we could actually bring the collaboration together and lift the conversation to be at a higher level. So I'm curious if both Reece and Squirrel could add their views.
So Jane's question was, if we've got a local framework and we've got to focus on impact, what role can the SDGs play in helping us bring this together?
As it goes, I think the SDGs play an incredible role. I've accidentally written on that in generosity. But I think there's a catch-22, and you know, I'm saying this to you with a different accent. As Australians, we need to consider something. So, can the Sustainable Development Goals focus the effort and help? Yes, because behind each goal, they have sort of more background targets and such that. And some of those actually speak to capacity building, even though it doesn't seem like that when you just look at the goals up at the top. But I would say Colin Pidd's done a research project on the definitions of success internationally, and says that in US, Germany, Japan. So in Germany, it's does this meet specification? 5 goals, tick, 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 project done. And in Japan, it's continuous iteration. Is this 2 in the first year, 3 in the next year, 4 in the next year? Fantastic. Only 4, but a successful project. In the US, it's that, did I solve a crisis? And what is it in Australia? Is there a piece of me involved? So an end game stakeholder looking at a project and judging it for success. So a government might be more likely to judge a project successful if they were on the steering committee, for example. They might be more likely to judge a project successful if they've been asked about XYZ location or input. And so it is very much, to borrow the New Zealand phrase, te tangata, te tangata, te tangata, people, people. I think the trap that we have to be careful as we bravely go into this global, I love that word, capacity building endeavor is that we value relationships more than Americans. We value relationships more than Germans, than Japanese, etc. Not necessarily than anyone anywhere, but to really make sure that it is an Australian definition of capacity building and impact that is being defined and championed by everyone.
That is really interesting. Can we park that and come back to that? Because that could be a huge barrier too. Sorry, I know. Jane needs the other half of her question answered. We'll come back to that. Yeah. Reece, I think.
Yeah, I mean, with the SDG, I mean, we think the SDGs are absolutely crucial and vital, and we celebrate that they are here and that we can report on them in our programs. And I think that is really slightly off topic, but another really exciting thing that's happening is that corporations are also reporting on the SDGs within their business plans as well, and that wasn't the case with the Millennium Development Goals. So yes, we think that these are excellent list of objectives and measurements, and going back to what Dan was talking about before about like really keeping hold of that vision, right? The SDGs, currently there's $500 million a year of funding for the SDGs in various ways. There's a $500 billion. There's a $2.5 trillion funding gap to achieve the SDGs by 2030. And so what we are taking on is, again, we think there's really exciting ways of using blockchain to increase the trust and in impact projects. And so the second of our big impact projects is actually a way of providing a curated list of impact projects that will help us to bridge that funding gap of $2.5 trillion globally by giving philanthropists and funders the confidence in these projects. And that isn't necessarily saying we're going to start off with the impact in mind, but it's saying we're going to curate them in a way that shows that these projects are trustworthy. And so that's the other big thing that we're sort of working on at the moment is how can we leverage our unique IP and our network at WWF to benefit the sector and work with other NGOs to bridge that $2.5 trillion funding gap. And the way we're doing that is by experimenting with blockchain. But we absolutely think this is a really important place for us to be focusing our attentions. Yep.
So Reece, can I just make sure I understand? So your frame around using blockchain is around the process of iteration and the process of releasing resources as a proposition is further proved and scaled, as opposed to there's a change I want to receive and we've worked out this particular tool to get there?
That is happening with blockchain at the moment. It's what we haven't chosen to focus on, that over the releasing of funds based on certain criteria being met. What we've chosen to focus on with blockchain, if you believe the hype, and we do after having a good look at it for 18 months, will significantly increase trust in any kind of transaction of value, and increases transparency and removes unnecessary intermediaries and blah, blah, blah. We think that we can leverage this technology to, and the decentralized nature of blockchain, to decentralize the project selection process and engage a lot more experts in this process, so that we're taking the responsibility out of NGOs and encouraging the expert community to help select impact projects. It's still very experimental for us, but we think that we can play a key role in helping get good projects the spotlight and the visibility they need for funders and philanthropists to have confidence in those projects. And so that's what we're currently working on at the moment with a spotlight on the sustainable development goals.
That's really exciting. So did you guys catch up with the budget announcement the other night of this $8 million that's been released to support impact measurement? So there were two tranches of money, about 6.4 million to create a sort of a set of methodologies to measure impact. And then I think there was about 1.6 million for the Commonwealth Government to run a pilot program with a community services partner where they pilot payment for outcomes and payment for impact. So there's not a lot more information around on that. There was a teleconference call yesterday with DSS. I don't think they actually know what happens next. They've just announced this 8 million, but it's worth keeping your eye on because I think you should talk to them. We had a question here. Sorry, yes.
Claudia Duits working for Cardano Development, and I'm setting up a project which works on clean cooking, so moving people away from open fires into improved cook stoves. And I'm particularly working on the financial side of it. And we're using the gold standard for the global goals, which is a standard which certifies the contribution to the SDGs. We also will use the data ledger technology blockchain. At any rate, what I find really difficult is that although our program will be able to measure and certify our outcomes to the SDG, is still to get donors involved in actually buying those outcomes. So although we've gone quite far, I think, in actually saying what we're going to prove, and they will become outcome buyers. So they're at the end of the line. So only once the result is there will they have to actually buy it. It's still incredibly difficult to get donors engaged, and maybe because it's a quite innovative approach. But I just wanted to ask the panel whether they have any advice or idea why it's so difficult if you come with quite an elaborate story about what you're going to achieve.
So Claudia's question is, what's the advice to get donors engaged when you have a change process where there is rigorous and clear evidence of impact and standardised, proven methodology for measuring it? How do you get donors involved? So I'm going to start with Gemma. So good being in control of the microphone.
I have no idea. But I would suggest it goes back to Dan's point on fundraising, and it needs to be a systemic shift to philanthropists and people being willing to fund fundraising, because essentially what I'm hearing is I haven't been able to sell my story, and that's a marketing comms issue, and that's a capacity building issue. So it comes back to that line, and advertising marketing is how Dan allocated it, but it's having non-profits being able to sell their story. And I think that's a sector-wide issue, is funding fundraising. And one thing that was top of mind for me when Dan was speaking is if we don't empower non-profits to fundraise themselves and fund that capacity building requirement, then what we've seen in Australia and what keeps getting sensationalised in the press is there will be for-profit businesses that come in and take that role. There will be marketing companies that snatch a consumer's dollar, a willing consumer who wants to buy that outcome, and they'll raise $1 and the non-profit will get 10 cents of that dollar and the for-profit business will get 90 cents. And then that creates another story in the front page of the leading newspapers, and people go, well, the charitable sector isn't doing its job, I'm not giving my money. So I think we really need to take heed of Dan's warning and build the capacity of non-profits to fundraise for themselves.
No, I think that was genius, basically. But I also think linking it to Dan's, so you take Colin Pidd's relationships count in Australia, and you take what Dan was saying, you need to pay more fundraisers because ultimately often they are the people cultivating relationships, whether that's digital relationships or interpersonal relationships. And that's where the crux lays. It's not that you're not getting the outcomes you need with the cook stoves. And I do not know if my next sentence is true. And if you were in Germany, you'd get heaps of funding because you're showing tick, 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 tick. However, you're not in Germany. You're operating in the Australian context. And if nothing else, that just convinced me what you said, that absolutely fundraising is critical because to show impact, yep, get the science behind it to show. Get your I don't even know what blockchain is. I'm going to have to look it up. You know, get your blockchains behind you. Get your cook stove mathematics behind you. But then you do need fundraisers and you do need people with those people skills because ultimately that's how you're going to have success in the Australian context.
So Claudia, just because I can't help myself, just 4 thoughts, not advice. People give money to people and it's how we connect with the head and the heart. So what you described, I think there are 4 possible lenses that you could look through to try and engage resourcing partners. There's the lens of the environmental sustainability, and there's a whole army of environmental funders that want the environmental outcome. They won't care so much about the other characteristics of your project, but that's what will speak to their head and heart. Then there's the lens around international development and self-determination and bringing communities in the full healthy sense of the word, socially, economically and physically and mentally, into a flourishing state, the people that understand and want to drive that sense through international development. Then there's the lens of impact, so there will be a bunch of funders that will get very excited about the fact that you do have that standardised evidence. And the 4th comment is actually if you've got the standardised evidence, maybe you shouldn't be looking for grants. Maybe your opportunity is in the whole blended social finance space, so low interest or no interest loans, so that triggers some kind of financial return as well as the social outcome. So it's about deconstructing your proposition into the different lenses that speak to the head and the heart with the people that you want to resource your outcomes, I think. Hello. Yeah. Yeah, all good.
Justine Felton here from the Odyssey Foundation. A couple of questions for Squirrel and Gemma. I think one of the most exciting things that I've seen in recent times was the announcement of Co-Impact out of the US that basically pools funding from members of the Giving Pledge, and they're starting with something like $500 million. And I think for me, the really exciting signal that gives is that there's more appetite for collaborative funding across foundations. And I'm just really interested to hear kind of perspective on that from Squirrel and Gemma.
So Justine would like Squirrel and Gemma to explore what is the real behavioural appetite for collaborative funding in Australia.
Incredibly strong, you're right. Our governors love it when we can get other foundations or government involved.
I hate the word collaboration. We do collaborative funding, and Squirrel's right, our board has a huge appetite for it, and there are real benefits to it if you do it well. But it's challenging, it's really challenging, and you have to have trust, you have to have open conversations, and you need to really flesh out everyone's agenda and understand what the shared goal is. and you need to be willing to give as well as to receive the benefits of collaboration. So I think there is a growing appetite for it, and from our experience, I think there's a learning curve on just exactly what is involved in collaborative funding, and for my mind, the end goal should be that it's less onerous on the organisation that you're supporting to be in a collaborative funded relationship, and for that to occur, then the funders have to make sure that they all understand what they're collaborating on.
And I'm going to, add my 2 pence worth. I think of it like a continuum. So at one end of the continuum, you've got the solo funding, and at the other end of the continuum, you've got genuine collaborative funding, and then you've got steps along the way. And sort of in the middle is that parallel play step. So I've got a project, I can't fund all of it, I'll go to my community, can you help me co-fund this? And it's parallel play. That's not collaborative funding. It's good, and we see a lot of that. But when we talk about collaborative funding in the sense of none of us know what we're going to be doing at the end of it, none of us know how we're doing it, we've got to cede our control and sovereignty of our funds into a collective decision-making process in partnership with the community that we want to work with. That's where, intellectually we know significant systemic sustainable change is going to come. But the way of working in that space, I think, is still very new to us and requires a lot of resourcing and a lot of time. And there are some standout examples of that. I think what Cages and Dusseldorp have done with the Just Reinvest work in Burke is a perfect example of that. But, when we talk about collaborative funding, we kind of tend to talk about everything on that continuum from parallel play through to that kind of nirvana collective community building, really.
And to clarify, our board would love parallel play and not go near the nirvana.
See? Yeah. Thank you, Squirrel. Another question, comment? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessie William from the Brownsville Project. This is such a good conversation. I had a question around the role that NGOs can play in advising our funders on what to fund next, not us but other people. So informally, our philanthropic funders ask us at Brownsville, you got to your end of the grant, you've been doing your work for 8 years, what are some seed funding ideas that you have for other people? And we give that advice freely and informally. Do you think there's an opportunity to formalise that in some way, or should we just keep building those relationships, giving our advice and letting it stay?
Thank you. So Jessie's question is a number of approaches on how to influence and advise philanthropists on what to fund next. Is there a way of moving it from the individual relationship, one-on-one conversation into something more formal and systemic and larger? I'm going to go to Jocelyn and Reece for a perspective on that, please.
Look, I think you just can't value those individual relationships enough. I think it really does come down to if someone's asking you that question, it's because you are a trusted advisor. I think when you start to formalise that process, in some ways you become more of a consultant, and that in fact creates less trust, and certainly for Indigenous communities. We want to know if someone's been paid or there's a formal process around making a recommendation, then it comes under a lot of scrutiny, whereas informal relationships and recommendations really carry a lot of weight.
Reece, you got a perspective? Or you can pass it to Gemma or Squirrel.
I might pass on that one if that's okay. Yeah. I don't have those specific relationships myself, so I'm probably not the best informed to answer it.
I just jumping in, and I'm not sure if I've read the comment formalise more, but if it's like a paid service, you're asking if there's a revenue stream. No, okay. Just, yeah, okay. I agree with Jocelyn. I just think if you've built a relationship and a trust with a funder and they're coming to you for ideas, then they're recognising that you're experts in the work that you're doing and really value the advice that you're giving. I don't think it needs to be formalised. We certainly have those conversations all the time. And there's nothing more validating, I think, for an organisation if they're willing to introduce other non-profits to you. I think it shows a real strength across numerous admirable qualities, and that advice or that recommendation carries a lot of weight when we are given them.
I think formalizing the relationship, no, I completely agree with what everyone else had said. However, to formalize the meeting ground opportunities, and I think that's where AEGN, Philanthropy Australia can come in handy to make sure those opportunities are happening, and that opportunity to network, to meet, to develop and grow relationships, that's good. I think the moment you formalize it, it'll lose its magic.
Now we've got one more question from the floor, but just before we do, I'm just going to prep these guys for my asking them the closing comments. I'm going to ask each of you 2 questions. I'd like each of you to tell us, as a result of this morning, so Dan's presentation, the questions that we have with Dan, this conversation, what is one thing that you individually and personally are going to take away and think about more because it's stimulated and prompted something in you? And what is one takeaway you can, or insight you can leave with the rest of us as a gift as we leave? So whilst you percolate that, do we have a final question? Thank you. Mike, down here, thank you.
Hi, my name's Judy Clark. I'm with the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Corporation. We're a peak body, and as Jocelyn pointed out, primarily funded by government funding, which is all very short-term, short-sighted. Dan talked a lot this morning about fundraising, and we've talked about a lot of other things, but maybe it's just me. We haven't talked a lot about what does fundraising look like, and where do you find the fundraising experts? Because we're not it. We're looking at rolling out social enterprises to become self-sufficient. We haven't looked at fundraising. So where do you find the expertise on fundraising?
Thank you. So the question is, where are the good fundraisers? There's one sitting over there, but I won't point him out because you can't all offer him a job because his organisation would then string me up. And what does good fundraising look like? So, anyone got any comments? Jocelyn?
I think it's really tough in Australia. You know, we don't have a culture of philanthropy. Generally, I mean, you saw the difference in Dan's points up there. 0.57% is how Australians spend, and yet we're such a generous community. Like when bushfires happen and when crisis occurs, we definitely do dig deep into our pockets, but we really have trouble asking for help. And so I think that we probably need to take some of Dan's learnings and then think more deeply about how to contextualise that for Australians, because it is really, really difficult to raise money. It's definitely relationship based. So I think for organisations like yours that are looking to start social enterprises, it's about picking particular organisations that want to do things like you're doing. But individual fundraising is tough in Australia.
Anyone else got any views?
This was going to be my parting comment, but it was around that fundraising question, and you're right, we haven't explored it, and Jocelyn's right, we don't do it well. And I suspect that the slide would be different if it was in the Australian context. But for me, the real opportunity for non-profits, because the philanthropic dollar is really small, it's 8%, I think 1%.
Structured philanthropy is 1%?
All giving. Oh, there you go, that feeds into my point even better. So 1% is structured philanthropy. So funding a grant writer or fundraising in that 1% structured giving context, that's not growing the pool. This rest, the 7%, which is just community-based personal giving, I'm assuming, for me, that's the real opportunity for huge growth. And so I think we need to build the capacity. Again, I really don't like the term capacity building, but we need to really develop those skills in non-profit organisations to tell their story to the Australian community and really build that fund, because that money is untied giving generally. You don't generally have someone giving their $20 a month to WWF going, oh, and by the way, you can only spend it on. So that's your untied money. That's the real valuable capital, and I think we should, as structured funders, be looking at how we, and this is what I'm taking away, how can we help the organisations we support to tap in and, more importantly, grow that pool.
And just because you've pushed a button and I can't help it, Judy, I think there are three things. The first one comes back to a comment I think that we made at the beginning about just reframing our language and our value of the whole flipping sector. You know, we are not a deficit on the community. We are not a drain on the government purse. We are not a handout recipient mentality because we don't know any better and can't do any better. We are a powerhouse of the Australian economy and of civic society. And I don't think we value fundraisers. We're almost apologetic about it. We don't pay well, we don't celebrate them, we don't laud them. Fundraising is a really effingly hard job, professionally and intellectually and from a skills basis. How do you get consumers to think and feel so much about you that they will give you their money? The other thing is it's an incredibly emotionally draining and difficult job. So how do we support our fundraisers to be resilient, to get the 99 no's, which feel really personal when you care about what they're going to be supporting, and celebrate the one yes? So I think we have to completely reframe how we value and think about fundraising and take it out of the gutter and put it on the top shelf and say this is what should be celebrated and lauded, not football players, but fundraisers, which comes to the whole sector piece. Sorry, see, big button, big push. Georgina,
Sorry.
final comment from the floor, go for your life.
Sorry. Yeah, I just had a comment. I agree. We don't applaud them, Sarah, and often it's they rename themselves as development managers or relationship managers. Why would you be called a fundraiser? Because that is just, you know, bottom of the pile. But I just wanted to make a comment, something about what Dan brought up, which I'm not sure I completely agree with, because he mentioned that you know, foundations are crap at fundraising, and so you should be you know, you should be giving the capacity to the non-profits. I actually disagree. I think it's I think foundations also have a great role to play in that, because we have, I run a foundation, we have good relationships with other foundations, so I think it's not just about saying to the non-profit, I'll give you 100k if you can go and match that, or times 10 it or whatever. It's about saying I will work with you to help enable that, and so therefore the responsibility is just as much on me as a non-profit, because we have relationships with each other. So it goes back a little bit to that continuum. And I know, Squirrel, you were saying, Ian Potter, we're more about co-funding versus right at the end there with collaborative funding. We've all said collaborative funding is very hard, and name it for what it is real collaboration, it is real resource intensive, but when it works, and there are a few examples, one is good for 360, which is in the room, where the funders did compile together, but it is so worthwhile. So I just wanted to make that comment that I think it's foundations can play a role as much as fueling the non-profits as well.
Yeah. Thanks, Georgina. I think that's really important. Now I need to repeat that for the tape.
Or just there's a case study on that on the Funding for Impact website.
Oh, well, there you go. Funding for Impact website. Excellent. Now we're going to wrap up with final comments from the panel. So, Jocelyn.
My thoughts on Dan's presentation is that we need to invest in marketing, and not just scattergun marketing, but who is our ideal customer. You know, this is advice that we give to social enterprises and Aboriginal enterprises. You know, really think about who your ideal customer is, rather than just spending a lot of money on a lot of different things. So get that right before you spend. And the second thing is, I've talked about this before, but I'm going to continue to say it. We're out there about levelling the playing field and making sure that Aboriginal people get to participate in the mainstream economy. But my big dream is to have a sharing economy, a true sharing economy like we had originally, and get rid of money altogether.
Gemma.
I can't top that. I just guess what, and I'll come back to my opening comment. I think what my real takeaway and what I'll go and work on is the fundraising, and how can I help and empower our partners to solve that piece. But the takeaway for the audience, and especially for the funders in the room, my challenge to you is to really think about your role in this relationship. And I think there's a real power imbalance between a funder and a fundee. and it's really the fundee that has the real power, in my opinion. They have the knowledge and the expertise to really shift the dial on some of our entrenched social issues. And so the small thing I have is capital. The real thing they have is knowledge and expertise. And if we can shift that thinking, then I think we open up those honest conversations and start that real dialogue and might be able to make more significant change.
I love Dan's thoughts on advertising and marketing of the sector and changing the conversation. I think, to add to Sarah and Gemma's point, that would be, I would love to see that happening in our sector. I'm watching with interest something that's happening. There's some message work being done by the Centre for Australian Progress on tax, to change the conversation, to change the frame on tax, to celebrate tax as something that we love, that we can have free healthcare and free education, and we've got a welfare net for the most vulnerable. And I'm loving seeing that work being done, and I would love to see something similar being done in our sector. And this is why it's so great that the Impact Hub are doing this work, and I would love to see us all thinking about how our organisations can contribute to a sector-wide approach to changing the conversation.
Thank you. Squirrel.
Yeah, speaking of sector, there's percolating talk in the evaluation sector of an evaluator general, and they're looking to philanthropy to sort of show what would that look like, serious, in government. I'm not kidding.
I've got the paper if anyone wants it. I'm happy to send it to you.
Go, Nicholas Gruen. You laugh now. Biggest takeaway, it's a bit of a stat geek thing, but I really liked how he presented the breakdown of fundraising versus overhead versus, and then also had the amount given for those different organizations over time. And I just thought, let's imagine if we have 100, 200 grantees, it's very easy to look at your annual reports. This is so top down, I'm sorry, but percentage dedicated to those causes, and then fundraising raised. Could ask you equally, but then come up with some sort of matrix where, this is about the median amount, this is solid, they're fundraising healthy, and rather than castigating the people who are fundraising poorly, approach and say, would you be interested in us giving you an impact enhancement grant to enhance your fundraising? Not like you're bad, but just like, do you need assistance? And you could say, no, thank you. Anyway, so I was mentally playing through what that would look like, and it's a simple thing to do, but that's my one takeaway, because the numbers will speak to the governors, but ideally be targeting to the folks, not the folks who are really smooth at fundraising, but the folks who are smooth at fundraising, got a grant from us, but really might need more help. And then the other thought that I have, my gift to you. Why not unite, coalesce? Why not? So one thing that we're doing at Potter, and this is, I think, in advance of the announcement, blank video, an executive leadership program in design with the Meyer Foundation. So watch this space, but the idea of being an intensive executive Australian-based leadership program with follow-up, and that would be, for capacity building. It is being co-designed, so it may take a bit. But I challenge you, could you not also approach people and foundations with that same idea for fundraising? Where is that executive, intensive, next step up? Not just I am professional, I am good, but I am a senior level, I've gone to XYZ course, and also an opportunity to share wisdom. So I guess my gift to you is a challenge to start creating that.
Thank you very much. Please thank the panel for their generous contributions and gifts.